It is my pleasure to introduce Michael to you. He is a psychotherapist with a background in psychology and clinical social work. And he has made a lifelong inquiry into the heartfelt sense of greater connectedness and belonging. His early spiritual life was within the catechisms of the Catholic Church, and he even considered going into the priesthood at one time before he met his wife, to whom he's been married 48 years. So I think that was probably a good decision.
49 now.
49 now.
Time passes.
He has 3 children and he has 4 grandchildren. He has sort of moved from the confines of organized religion to engage with poets and scientists and mystics and teachers from a great many traditions. He claims that he does not hold to specific truths, but he has likely stories that he's probably going to tell us about tonight. And as we know about stories, some of them are apt to change as circumstances change. He places less emphasis on belief and more on our personal experience. He has spent over 45 years in the clinical setting as a psychotherapist, in which he has learned about himself and also about how people, his clients, cope with crisis and how they can move beyond fear and reactivity to greater freedom and love. He says that conventional psychology has much to offer us in facing our pain and suffering, but he's come to believe as well that a spiritual perspective is essential to living beyond the self-referential limitations of the ego. So with that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to you, Michael. And I think you're going to start with a meditation.
Yes, I think it's a tradition here to start with a meditation. That sounds like a great way to connect to ourselves and to each other. So in your particular way of meditating, I'll invite you, and I'll set a timer for 5 minutes and welcome you all to find your place and your meditation state. That was quick. I'm going to stand and readjust the camera so that visible. Great.
Step back just a bit.
Yeah. Is my voice going to carry for all of you? Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Phil was threatening me with this, and I've never worn one before, and it feels a little bit like something in my face, you know. Not used to that sort of thing, but it did kind of give me the impression of being one of those very technical people that really knows what they're doing, you know, with the machine and all that. So I want to welcome you all, and as is the title of the talk is something about internal family systems, and
I have to step back.
yeah, okay.
Thank you.
And I'm just curious, first of all, if who amongst you is familiar with internal family systems? They've read a book about it. No? 2, 3? So that means the majority of you are wondering what the heck is internal family systems theory, right? So I will do my best to communicate in a way that's introducing rather than assuming that you know stuff. And I'll ask you during my talk if you have something that you need to clarify, that you don't quite understand what I meant, or my words didn't come through too clearly, you're welcome to put up your hand and let me know. So just to make sure that I'm being heard. And afterwards, I guess I'll be talking for about 50 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, you know, so that any sort of thoughts you have about things you'd like to learn more about or hear more about, save them for the end, and we'll cover them at that point. So, did you come with an idea? Well, this must be interesting, or like, how did you think that this would be a good idea to come to this? Is this because this is a meditation meeting, or is there something about internal family systems that caught your eye and made you wonder?
Well, I think we all have our own internal family systems.
Yeah.
There might be different labels
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
We've all gone through them.
Yeah.
Some of us, or a lot of us, might be re-examining them
Yeah.
and trying to see where it has taken us, where it's brought us,
Yeah.
and where we want to take it
Yeah.
moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on what caught their eye about the idea of internal family systems? You're just, okay.
I recently did an art therapy diploma, and we talked a little bit about internal family systems,
Okay.
but not enough that I felt like, oh,
Yeah.
I really understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've been doing it for 18 or 20 years, and I can still find myself at moments saying, oh, what does that mean? And I don't quite understand, you know. So that's cool. I mean, you get a little taste, and okay, tell me a little bit more about that. So I'll do my best to share with you something that hopefully when you walk out tonight, you'll have gotten something that feels useful to you. Internal family systems began with Richard Schwartz. He's a family therapist who found himself not particularly happy with the kind of work he was doing and the kind of results he was getting with conventional family therapy. And so he began to wonder, and he has a marvelous kind of curiosity and creativity that led him along the way towards creating a model that essentially is saying, within us are kind of like a family, different parts, as in different members, that constitutes who we are and how we operate. And the goal of my presentation perhaps is to give you some sense of how that works and how that might be useful. As I mentioned, probably about 18 or 20 years ago, I was at Esalen, which is an institute, you know, just a little south of Monterey. Are you familiar with that one? Yeah. I've been there quite a few times, like maybe 15 times, and one particular year I was there, I was attending a course, but I got to know a group of people at another table at lunchtime, and they seemed very friendly and eager, and I was very attracted to the energy of the group. And I met Richard Schwartz, or Dick Schwartz, at that time. And it just seemed like it left that impression on me, not because I knew anything about internal family systems, just they seemed like good people, warm people, interesting people. So a couple of years later, I discovered that there was a workshop at Esalen led by Dick Schwartz that was about internal family systems. And so I attended, and I attended for 5 consecutive years. So it was a 1-week kind of intensive for 5 consecutive years, and then subsequently undertook the more formal training, which was a 2-week intensive spread around the country, around the States, and have been practicing internal family systems along with everything else. I mean, I've been doing this work for getting on 46 years, actually I've celebrated 46 years last May, so a very long time, and I've gathered a lot of different ideas, and somehow or another I've found a way of fitting them together, and internal family systems is just one model of how to work with people that will support them. I have a psychotherapy practice, in a private practice, and so I work with people, and it feels like a very useful thing, and perhaps I could say a little bit about what I find useful about the system, and then I'll explain a little bit more about how internal family systems works, if that makes sense to you. Generally speaking, it's simply a model that's intended to respond to people coming through the door saying, I've got anxiety, I've got depression, I'm in a lot of conflict with my partner, I have addictions, various kinds of things that I will see in the course of my work. And it's one among many, but it has its own unique qualities. It's not entirely unique in the sense that there are other models that use a lot of similar ideas, but internal family systems has its own unique course and its own useful things. And some of the things that appeal to me are, first of all, it's not pathologizing. When someone comes in dealing with an issue, traditional psychiatry, psychology is tempted to want to classify it as something wrong with you that we want to fix. Right? That's based on a Western philosophy that's pretty predominant, which is the idea of reductionism, of control. And so we want to take up this issue that you have, and we want to get it out of your life. We want to do something to fix you. And I find that a particularly unhelpful model to work with. I was trained in it originally, so I certainly had my familiarity with it. But what I find about internal family systems, instead of saying, what's wrong with you and how can we fix you, it becomes more, what's going on for you and how can we rebalance what's happening, on the assumption that, first of all, it's not a sign of something wrong with you, it's a sign of you being out of balance, it's a sign of what you've learned to do in the face of trauma or cultural conditioning that has set you up to see yourself in a certain way, to live in a certain style, that sometimes people will find, it's not working for me. My life isn't working, and how I'm feeling and what I'm going through makes no sense to me, and it scares me, and I need help. Well, so instead of thinking of it as something wrong with you, we want to think of it as an opportunity to grow. Right? And that's a very different perspective to bring, and internal family systems work emphasizes that particular way of understanding the human being as a system, a marvelous system, an incredibly intricate system, and one that has a lot of power to successfully engage with the world and with ourselves. However, we are all growing up in imperfect families, in cultures that sometimes are a little bit crazy, and we encounter traumatic experiences of one kind or another, acute traumas such as motor vehicle accidents or abuse of one kind or another, but also what I call chronic or subtle kinds of traumas where we've just learned to live within a crazy environment that's traumatizing, but it's what we've always known, so we wouldn't recognize it as trauma. It's just that we find ourselves terribly unhappy, terribly anxious, terribly withdrawn, terribly out of sorts with the world, something like that, right? So we're appreciating that. What we're wanting to do is to kind of recognize how this marvelous system that you are, this marvelous spirit that you are, this marvelous biology, this marvelous neurology and psychology, how can we rebalance this, and how can we create an experience of connectedness rather than disconnection? One of the things you'll find, at least this is my experience, when we are engaging in life from a perspective of fear, and life might be out there or it might be in here, when we are engaging from a perspective of fear, the reaction will always take the form of disconnection, one kind of disconnection or another. Self-hatred, self-dismissal, isolation, avoidance, addiction that blots out our capacity to be present, that kind of thing. Is that making sense? That fear separates us, disconnects us from ourselves and from what we might imagine to be our highest capacity to be in this world and to be within ourselves. Freedom or health or connectedness is related to a principle that is kind of central to internal family systems, and it's the idea that we're discovering relatedness within our struggle. What we're afraid of, things that we carry with us, beliefs or painful memories or painful ideas about ourselves, these things are, in some respects, states of disconnection, of isolation. And the simple principle is people learn how to protect themselves, and they do that instinctively when we're very young. Before we have any cognitive capacity, we have the capacity instinctively to find a way to create safety when we do not feel safe. And in situations that are unsafe, we have the capacity to adapt. And sometimes the price of adaptation is a lifestyle based on fearful avoidance or self-doubt or uncertainty about our place in the world, our tendency to be harshly self-critical, ways of removing ourselves from things that we no longer feel safe with. As a child, it's instinctive. Children will do one of two things in the face of the threatening environment. They will either take up responsibility for the other person's feelings towards them. The kind of assumption is there must be something wrong with me. How can I get you to love me? Will I overperform? Will I avoid sharing my needs in order to not rock the boat, not to ask too much from you? And so there's a sense of over-responsibility. And the other way is under-responsibility, withdrawal, disconnection, no longer willing to accept responsibility in relationships, like sealing oneself off from what is painful. Either style becomes a habit that we bring into our adult life that becomes problematic. And often we encounter situations that acutely tell us it's not okay. We don't feel okay, and our situation isn't working out. And this is when people have the opportunity to look at themselves in a way perhaps that they have not been able to before. Desperation always is one of the seed beds of opportunity to grow. Many times in my work, where I try to integrate psychology and spirituality, we often have these camps that either we are materialist and psychologically oriented, and most of psychology is oriented towards the ego, adaptation, fixing, repairing, supporting, strengthening. And there's a kind of, we don't go into the spiritual realm. That's not our thing. And so matters of spirituality that often are central to people's struggles aren't really touched on. And we also have the spiritual camps that will kind of disown ego, or want to kill the ego, or want to let go of the ego. And that too is a strange kind of arrangement to try and live a life without the benefits of ego, the ability to adapt, the ability to be in the world, to participate, to think about what you want, to make choices. I want to integrate them, and IFS has that capacity to honor both the spiritual and the psychological or the being in the world process. IFS is a set of tools that people can take away for themselves. So it's something that's not just done to you. You can begin to get the tools and begin to use them for yourself. And I've had, a number of cases that are very poignantly true of people who have had very severe abuse backgrounds, who have found not too much help in a lot of different ways. But with IFS, they gained an ability to work with themselves in ways that helped them to avoid suicidal behavior or addictive behaviors like getting drunk or going into highly anxious states. They were able to work with themselves in such a way as to consciously work with their fear rather than try to escape their fear. Again, the idea is the fear-based principle of living is always to get away from what threatens you, disconnect from what it is you don't feel safe with. But healing inevitably is about reconnecting, restoring relationship, creating a sense of understanding, compassion that can allow us to experience the dilemma as an opportunity to restore a connection that has been lost one way or the other. Is this making sense so far? Pretty cool. IFS reminds us that what goes on inside of us is the model we bring to our outer relationships. So when we're working with ourselves, we're creating the principle for working successfully with our relationships with the world at large or with individual people, marriages, children, the whole works. So it's valuable to recognize that inner family is like outer family, and we can see that when we work with ourselves, when we bring compassion and curiosity to the way in which we are experiencing ourselves, the things we do, we have a capacity to get how that would be true in our relationships, which increases our capacity for empathy and our capacity to see in a more positive light a partner who may be not happy or may be critical or may be in some ways angry with where we're at, So we can stay in the conversation and increase the likelihood that we can find our way towards a greater connection. As I've mentioned, IFS probably is one of the best models I have found that creates an interface with spirituality. There's a concept called big S self. If I had a whiteboard, we were trying to find a whiteboard and we weren't able to find one, so the benefits of a graphic image is not available to us, but I'm going to try and sort of help you to sort of see what I'm referring to. That there are small s self, which is the individual specific qualities of us and our ways of thinking and our ways of feeling and our patterns of reactivity. Then there's capital S self, which is that capacity to observe ourselves. I can observe my unhappiness or my anxiety, and I can bring curiosity and compassion to that. I could be curious, well, isn't that interesting how quickly I became angry at that situation or how anxious I became in that situation? So we have the ability to engage with a capital S self, and then there's a further self called capital S, capital E, capital L, capital F. That is the transcendent dimension of what we are. And internal family systems weaves that into its picture. And I think that's the kind of balance that all of us are needing, is not just how to be in the world successfully, but also to find the perspective that helps us to address the question of, and exactly why am I here, and what is my purpose, and what does it mean to be living through this time, this loss of a partner, this particular experience. And I'm sure if I asked you, there wouldn't be a single person that would not say, I've been through something pretty hard, and it really threw me for a loop. And I found myself desperately looking for a way of understanding how this could still make sense in my life. Well, that's part of the emphasis in internal family systems. So it also provides, internal family systems also provide something that I like, which is a kind of non-confrontational access to the deeper patterns that are behind people's struggles. Inevitably, there is a sense that I have the symptom in mind, the thing I don't like about myself or my situation or what's happening to me. But beneath that are patterns shaped by history, by stories, by beliefs we have, and reactive patterns that we've lived by in our life. And the ability to sort of recognize and access these patterns and actually to touch base with the working ingredients of our patterns empowers us to be able to not only cultivate greater awareness, but then to have a choice about where we go when we recognize what's going on for us. And that's the personal power that I think we're all looking for, is the ability, no matter what's happening, to be able to have the freedom to look with curiosity and compassion at our circumstance, what seems to be going on in my body, what seems to be going on in my emotions, what seems to be going on in my head. The ability to work with this rather than try to escape this. A simple example would be, I have an Irish background, and there's certainly a bit of a cliche around Irish, being Irish and having an affinity for alcohol, right? It's not unique to Ireland, but there's a bit of a cliche there. And the sense is, when I'm upset, I need to get drunk. I need to get away from this feeling, right? And I work with a lot of addictions, and my experience is that it's very human and incredibly understandable that we want to escape pain. The deal is, disconnecting from ourselves doesn't mean we escape pain. It just means that we incapacitate our ability to work with our pain. And so for the amount of time that we're out of ourselves, whether it's in alcohol or in a dissociative state, when we're not in our bodies, or when we are shutting down and becoming numb and kind of empty, whatever it is we do to get away from ourselves, it doesn't go away. The pain doesn't go away. The pain goes underground, it'll come back again, and often it will show up unconsciously in the form of moods or in the form of behaviors that we can't explain or reactions we don't understand. Yeah? So getting away isn't an option, but it's a favored sport for most of us. We'd like to blame somebody else. We'd like to get away from that feeling. And the desire, the fundamental principle that I certainly encounter in Buddhism is turn towards what scares you. Or a famous saying, I'm not sure where it comes from, but the cave that you are afraid to enter holds your treasure. There's something about being willing to be with ourselves in these most difficult times that has the promise to create growth and new understanding. But it takes courage. And perhaps it takes a bit of a structure such as IFS that will give you a way of looking at how you can do that. Certainly meditation is very much seen as a valuable tool that makes sense to IFS because it's asking you to observe your experience. And your skills that you develop around self-observation become extremely valuable in your ability to work with yourself in the IFS way. Just checking to see how I'm doing for time. Okay. I go till 8 o'clock, is that right? Okay.
Or after.
What? I don't have to.
No, or after. No,
Oh, I see.
shorten the question.
Okay, that's great. So, here we are. Okay, so let me describe a little bit. I've been talking generally about IFS and about the ideas of health and healing, but let me talk more specifically about the model of IFS. And it begins with an interesting assumption. And I'm thinking that IFS from a distance can look kind of weird, you know, like it's very different from conventional ways of addressing ourselves to our experience. But it begins with an assumption that we are a multiplicity, not a unity. And that means the conventions of Western psychology and Western philosophy tend to hold out the idea we have this one mind, and that's I. And all the things that come out are from this I. And yet, we all have the experience of being mad at ourselves or worried about ourselves. And you kind of think, okay, if I'm mad at myself, am I the part that's mad or the self that has incurred this anger? Huh? What am I? You know, we don't have a unity. We have this duality or even multiplicity. And that assumption is actually, although it's been pathologized, multi-personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder is when people entertain the idea of having different parts. The truth of the matter is, that's how we function, and it actually is a pretty common way we have of talking about ourselves. Part of me wants to go to that movie, and part of me wants to just stay home, you know? We have this sense of, there's more than one kind of experience or center of experience and decision-making in play within ourselves. And there are three essential parts, or what we say categories of parts, that constitute the internal family systems model of the mind. There is, first of all, what we call protective parts. And that's a large category that it can include many. And when I'm working with people who are dealing with some pretty serious stuff, it often becomes a little bit like a Russian novel. There's a whole bunch of characters showing up, a whole bunch of different aspects of self. There's the part of me that is anxious and preoccupied with getting things right and worried about being wrong. And then there's the part that gets mad at me because, mad at the part that is so anxious. You're wasting your life, you're spoiling things, you're working way too hard, So we have these two parts that are both operating, when you look carefully, as a kind of protection for ourselves. And the question is, what is it protecting? Right? Well, that's one of the things we want to be able to do in our inquiry with a person is, what is it that you're protecting? What is it you're afraid would happen if you didn't do this particular thing? If you didn't obsess about this, what are you afraid would happen? If you didn't withdraw from that situation, what are you afraid would happen? Those kinds of questions. But it's a way of kind of poking into the question of what is it that these particular parts are protecting? But the assumption is it's a protection process, even if they don't look very protective. Like anger doesn't look particularly protective unless we can appreciate that, behind the anger is a belief that I'm in grave danger if I don't keep you at a distance or if I don't puff myself up. I will feel unworthy, those kinds of things. So, protective parts, it goes back to an idea that instinctively when we come into the world, there are protections. Probably the one that I notice, watching my children and my grandchildren, is the incredible power of an infant's gaze to lock you in. Do you ever notice that? That sense of a child can look at you and so engage you that you just want to protect them. You just want to, admire them and love them and make sure they're okay and all that. But we have a variety of instinctive ways of protecting ourselves. And these often form the basis for successful being in the world. Ways I have of withdrawing from threatening situations, ways I have of stepping forward to grab opportunities, to protect myself from pursuing things that would be of value to me. Where things get difficult is when any kind of trauma or confusion, experiences of abandonment, and they can be many, like when you think about family of origin stories that I've heard from clients, just an example would be, I've had quite a surprising number of clients who have been born into a family where a sibling ahead of them had died. And the mother was in grief. When she gave birth to this child, she wasn't emotionally available. And there's a sense of abandonment, a sense of uncertainty, and a learned way of trying to protect themselves by reaching out, by trying to be the mother to the mother, trying to try very hard to be perfect in order to be loved. But they've learned this protective part has emerged, which is a kind of extreme version of self-protection that has problems attached to it, but at the time, it's a survival strategy. The primary threat to a child's survival is the loss of connection, a loss of it. There's a saying that says a lone baboon is a dead baboon, right? That notion that what we're looking at is the potential to feel instinctively the threat to survival and the ability to mobilize. And if there isn't the normal access to reassurance and support, then there is strategies, almost like psychological energy gets co-opted into a way of thinking, a way of feeling, and a way of reacting. And of course, in infants, there's not a lot of thinking in the sense that we would talk about it as adults, but there is embedded patterns of belief that are so powerful that they prevail and they become the habits that we bring into our adult life. There are the ways in which we engage in relationships. There are the ways in which we talk to ourselves. There's the ways in which we deal with difficult situations. And all of that basically represents a pattern of coping, a way of being in the world, a way of preserving or protecting my need to find love, to find safety. So there's this sense of these parts having an important place, but as we grow older, we move from the helplessness, the inability to recognize what's going on for me, we move, in infants, towards the time when, as adults, we have a lot of choice. We can say no. We can make other choices. We can have a perspective that we could never bring to our life as infants. But nonetheless, the habits of the infant experience or the young child's experience prevails. And so people will say, I don't understand why I feel this way. It feels crazy to me. Even though I'm a confident person who's achieved a lot, I still find myself waking up in the middle of the night with anxiety. Or I find myself being very unavailable to my partner, and it's threatening my marriage. Or I'm finding myself in addictions, and I can't understand why I do it, because it's crazy. I'm destroying my life, and I can't stop. So people can get locked into patterns of self-protection. And this is the category of parts that I'm referring to as protective parts. And so there's an assumption that when people come in and they're saying, I'm having this kind of struggle, whether it's an addiction, it's an anxiety thing, it's an anger thing, whatever it is, depression, my thought is, from an IFS perspective, is, okay, what are you protecting? And how did you learn to believe that this kind of protection was necessary for you? Yeah. I'll move into talking a little bit more about how specifically we work with it, but I just want to kind of outline the category of protective parts. And then I want to move to another category. We're doing 3 categories, really. The second category is what we call exiles. And exiles are the parts of us that we've never learned to feel safe with. Often they are parts that perhaps in our family weren't acceptable. My enthusiasm was not welcomed in my family, or my withdrawnness was misunderstood and not seen as something acceptable. So I learned how to keep up to myself or hold back from sharing, or I learned to get away from my family, or disconnect from people whenever I felt things that I believed people couldn't understand or wouldn't accept. There are the traumatic experiences, so as I said, some of them are subtle, and some of them are acute, that result in extreme kinds of adaptations, extreme beliefs about myself. Whenever I talk to someone who has had a traumatic experience, one of the questions we'll have is, what did you find that you believed about yourself in that hot moment when you were in that car accident or when you were being sexually assaulted? What did you believe was true for you? And that's a hard question because they think it's what I was figuring out in my head, but actually no, there's a more subtle and powerful way in which we grab onto a certain belief about what's true for me. And so people will say things like, I'm simply not safe in the world, or I don't belong in the world, or I'm not good enough. You know, those kinds of things that are part of the exiled part of us. And you know, you begin to see the dynamic now that is highlighted in IFS, which is my protective parts keep me away from my exiled parts. My urge to anger keeps me away from the feelings of inferiority or loneliness. My avoidance of situations with other people keeps me away from the reminder that I don't feel good enough with other people. And I'm wanting to avoid the dangers of feeling rejected. Sometimes how we trace those things out, you know, these beliefs, is we'll just ask, okay, so when you're anxious, what do you think is going on for you? What are you afraid would happen? And so, well, I'll just be, I won't be able to function in my work, okay? And what will happen if you can't function with your work? Well, then I would feel possibly unemployed, and if you're unemployed, what's the worst thing that would happen? Well, perhaps I would feel destitute or lonely or incapable of being in this world. You know, you can track down. You know, there's a language in IFS called the trailhead, where you just kind of follow from the symptom, the initial experience, and you just track it, and you'll find that deeper and more powerful belief that's in play. And that is a helpful way of becoming connected to the exiled parts of us. Yeah. So there's a dynamic between protectors and exiles, and typically it's about the protectors exist to keep the exiles from overwhelming the system. The trauma that has the potential to get triggered by life events of one kind or another could threaten to overwhelm, and so I shut myself down, or I grab a bottle of alcohol, or I go into anger rather than my fear. I do something to keep at bay what I'm feeling that is too scary and threatens to overwhelm me. Does that make sense? You get a sense of how the fundamental dynamics of self-protection divide into two camps. One is the painful beliefs and memories and beliefs about self that accumulate through our life experience. And then we have the protector parts that are designed to keep what threatens to overwhelm us from doing so. And of course, it's at a cost. So what is normal protection suddenly becomes extreme protection. And as Dick is fond of saying, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, is kind of an accumulation of all the different ways in which we see the dramas of exiles and protectors. Okay? The third part in this system, this category, is capital S-E-L-F, self. We have little selves, the things that are particular to me and expressions of my personality, but there's capital S self, which is, in Dick's experience, and certainly it makes sense to me, and it's certainly part of how I look at things. Everyone has a capital S-E-L-F. Everyone has an aspect of them that has a capacity to rise above the personal and particular. Often it's not as caught up in what's happening, into the storyline that we're captivated by, the pattern that we get caught in. Hello? So self is a kind of interesting continuum between what we think of as a more conscious awareness of ourselves, an ability to observe ourselves, which represents an ability to not be caught up in the drama of our fear or our reactivity. And it's referred to as differentiating a sense of self. It's a way of saying that when I am aware of my anxiety, I have a choice to work with my anxiety. I have a choice to see, okay, draw upon my own knowledge of what's happened to me before when I've done this and that. I have a choice about what I can do. When I'm blended, when my sense of self is blended with this particular protective part, the one that believes that the world is a dangerous place and I am threatened with danger, when we're blended with that, there is no choice. There's just an automatic doing what you always do and getting what you always get. Patterns of experience that often people begin with, they'll say, this is why I'm here. This is always happening to me. And it's been happening for a long time and I don't know what to do. I don't understand. So part of this goal, when we talk about self, is to appreciate that we have the capacity to rise above our particular and personal preoccupations, the anxieties, the preoccupations, the formulas, the beliefs about self, and to become curious and compassionate with these parts. And that's the beginning of the healing potential of internal family systems. It begins with this notion that we can become engaged with, rather than settle for the same old thing over and over again, the avoidance, the shutting down, whatever it is that we do when we're threatened. We can become activated in an awareness practice, very similar to mindfulness practice, and we can begin to engage. One of the ways that we can recognize that we're in self, as opposed to in small s self, caught up in our old and familiar formulas and dramas and reactions, there are certain qualities that will show up. And that's how we can kind of begin to recognize the difference between being caught up in protective patterns and reactive patterns and being able to work with our patterns. And for simplicity's sake, I suppose Dick identified 8 qualities, and they're all starting with C, so it's a kind of a convenient way of remembering, although I find myself never able to remember off the cuff all the 8 of them. So, where are they here? The 8 C's: compassion, curiosity. Curiosity is interesting because when we are curious, we're asking questions. We're expressing an openness and an engagement. When we're anxious, you'll notice when you're anxious, thinking is always a lockdown thing, always a certainty. This is exactly what it is. This is what's going to happen to me. Curiosity is, I wonder what's happening. I wonder what's going on for me when I feel this way, when I find myself wanting to do this. Calmness. Do you know that sense of calmness that you can sometimes experience where it just feels like everything releases? Everything feels at ease. The world seems like a friendly place. It feels like it's okay, I can move through this world without any kind of anxiety. Perhaps it's tied into notions of mystical experiences like nature mysticism, where we suddenly, when we see Halley's, or not Halley's Comet, but the comet that was passing over, I think it's got a number to it. Right?
Atlas Comet.
Okay, or we see the moon, or we see an infant, or we see beautiful landscape, and we can find ourselves suddenly out of any state of worrying about anything and just, In the Jewish tradition, there's this notion that spirituality begins with awe. Clarity. that sense of being able to see clearly and having a confident sense, I'm recognizing what's going on here. I'm recognizing what's happening. I'm recognizing a choice I have in this moment. Creativity, connection, that sense of belonging as opposed to disconnection. Courage, I think that's 8 C's. You got any one of those, and you've got a sense of being in touch with capital S self, being in a place of being able to work with your experience rather than trying to get away from your experience and to disconnect or disown what is threatening. Right? Who? It's 8 o'clock. Time flies when you're having fun, huh? Now, one of the things I know about this work is it's, in one sense, simple, but gets very complicated. There's a lot of things to think about and a lot of things to understand in order to make this a useful system. So, trying to walk between the oversimplifying and the overcomplicating kind of way of looking at this. I'm going to say a few more things, and then I want to open up some space for talk. But how do I do this work? How does an IFS practitioner do this work? Well, first of all, you just begin by saying, okay, so what is it that you want to work on? And as you practice with this, people will learn to check in with themselves, not just out of their head. They will check in with their bodies and their emotional state. They will do a body scan. They will begin to recognize feelings in their body that correlate to certain kinds of concerns or issues. And so they will be able to more astutely name what is my body, what is my emotional state asking me to pay attention to right now. But once we've established that, the beginning is, okay, so I'm going to take a simple example. Say someone is talking about anxiety, a particular kind of anxiety, because there's many different flavors. There's panic anxiety, generalized anxiety, phobic anxiety. There's a lot of different kinds of anxiety, but we'll just say anxiety. And they'll share a few of the particulars about that anxiety, how it shows up, and what it is that bothers them about that. One of the things we'll ask them to do is locate it in their body. Where do they feel the energy of that anxiety? And that's important because IFS believes in the integration of body experience with emotional experience, with psychological experience, with spiritual experience. So we want to bring the body in because the body says a lot. It tells the truth that a mind often doesn't. Our mind is a spin doctor, right? It comes up with whatever explanation seems suitable, keeps me from being too upset or too lonely or whatever. But our body pretty much says what is. Our emotional life is much more accurate as well. And so we ask people to check in with their bodies and locate that. And what's that feeling like? Is it a weight? Is it a knife? Is it a knot? What's happening in your body? And where are you located? And when you're familiar with various aspects of the body system, the energy systems of Kundalini Yoga or traditional Chinese medicine, you can begin to appreciate, when they locate it here, when they locate it here, when they locate it here, that there's significance and correlates to traditional understandings of those parts of the body. The second question we ask is, how do you feel about this experience, this anxiety that you have? Which is an odd question, isn't it, in a way. But it's intended to create two things. One is to create an observing platform for this experience, rather than, then immerse them in the study of their anxiety. We're asking them to take a step back and just, how do you feel about this anxiety? And if the answer is negative, we know that there's another protective part in play, one that is objecting, that doesn't trust it, feels unsafe with the anxiety, probably for some good reasons. And we want to get that part to step back And how do we do that? It's kind of an intuitive way of inviting that person to check in with themselves and allow an image, a thought, perhaps words to show up and be a response to these questions. So I'm asking the client, check in, and how do you feel about that? And do you see the part that's kind of angry at your anxiety, really unhappy because you're interested? Can you ask that part if it would be willing to step back so we can have more connection to your anxiety and we can explore things? And maybe it takes a little bit of work to do that, maybe it's pretty easy, it depends from the client, but we clear up space, we're working with the anxiety, and we begin to explore anxiety, not from the perspective of, or can we get the pathological perspective on how wrong or bad this is, but let's kind of engage the anxiety. What is it protecting? What is it afraid would happen if you stopped being anxious? Interestingly enough, anxiety is serving an important function. And how old does this part think you are? What an odd question, right? But surprisingly, often there is an answer that comes out that's in single digits. In other words, there's a part of us that's very young, as experiencing the dynamic of something way back when, as though it was still true. And so sometimes there's an interesting exchange where you can say, I'm sitting with a 38-year-old client, and that part just said it thought you were 4 years old. That's something that came up just the other day with a client. And the question to the part is, does it surprise you to know that that she isn't 4? She's 38, she's married, she has a master's degree, she's got a job, she's got a home and 2 children. Does that surprise you? And of course the part is a little bit flabbergasted, but it highlights the fact that many times traumatic formulas for self-protection freeze at a certain time in their life and hold that rigid kind of form unless we can unfreeze them, unless we can kind of engage with them. And we want to bring some sympathy into the encounter. We want to explore what's this like for you to be anxious on 24/7 alert? What is that like? Do you ever get tired? What's it like for you to find that there's no other parts that seem to be in play here, that you kind of think of yourself as the one person, the one thing that's holding your life together? What's that like for this part? And often they will kind of again highlight how exhausted or anxious and tired they are. So you get the sense you're talking to a person, not just a psychological state. And that's how these parts evolve. They go from a collection of beliefs and reactions and feelings to a kind of independent entity, a life unto itself. And so you can actually engage with these parts. And to kind of move along more quickly than I'd intended, we get to the place where we say, okay, so what are you afraid would happen if you stopped with your finger on the red button, always pushing anxiety? What are you afraid would happen? And they might say something like, I'll be abandoned, or I'll be a failure, or I'll be destitute, something, or I will be I'll go crazy, whatever it is. And it's always interesting to realize that as a therapist, no, I'm not trying to figure you out. I'm just interested in you telling me what it's like for you, what that experience is like. And we'll use that language, and now we're going to go to the part of you that perhaps does have a sense of devastation or aloneness, and we're going to work with that part. And then we perhaps have these parts connect up, and then we'll bring the self in, and the self will be acknowledging or working with or creating a conversation where we can say, what is it that you need from self or from her that would help you to feel less alone, less anxious? And it's surprising how much when we engage in these questions of what do you need, what is it you like to tell her, what is it you'd like her to know about what it's like for you, you begin to kind of elaborate a story, a picture, and a drama that can be worked with, that shows up in the body and shows up in the way that tears flow and feelings. It becomes a very engaged process, very powerful process that ultimately we get to a place where we can talk about unburdening, meaning parts of the psyche that are in exile are actually vital energies that have been burdened down with beliefs and fears and beliefs about self that keep it from being as vital as it could be. And so we have an unburdening process, relieving that, once we've had a chance to investigate and connect. And so that brings us into a process of healing, a way of then taking it away and experimenting, digesting the experience, perhaps picking up in the next session, that kind of thing. So I hope I've given you kind of an overview about something that's very, in my opinion, a very different way of talking and thinking about our experience. But I hope you can also get the sense of how this can be a tool that you can use for yourself. And if you're interested, there's a book, my tea spilled there, oh my gosh. There's a book called No Bad Parts, written by Dick Schwartz. It's a really good, straightforward presentation of the whole model in much more detail than I could give you in this limited amount of time. But I hope this has kind of got you some idea of what we're talking about when we say internal family systems, and perhaps how you can begin to look at yourself, your relationships, and your experience in the world in a way that represents increasing connectedness, increasing confidence, and then remember all those C words: curiosity and courage and compassion and creativity. I hope that can get something started for you. And you can take that forward if you like into reading and sitting down with an IFS therapist if you like, that kind of thing. So we are at a place where this is the question period, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
we have about 15 minutes.
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes. So
Before we start with questions, I'd just like to thank you for a very thorough and interesting introduction to
yeah,
internal.
I hope it was thorough enough to make sense. That there's a sense of how lovely it is, how very human it is to work with ourselves this way. That you don't need a straitjacket, you don't need, a lot of times medication is part of the problem in the sense that it's intended to block off access to our pain. And so if you want to go through life numb, that's okay. But is that really what we were born to be? Is numb or disconnected? So it's a way of promoting connection and valuing and self-trust, something like that. So feel free to ask questions. I've given you enough to make you curious or even disagree. Yeah?
You made a brief reference to protectors that are, I can't remember the word, but are a necessity, are not in the sense of IFS, but
Yeah.
those are there for a good reason.
Yeah.
And we need to keep those there.
Yeah.
What are some examples? Like, the only one I can think of is when, a kid's gonna run out in the street and,
Yeah.
there's fear there,
Yeah.
which is there for a good reason. But outside of that kind of thing, I was trying to think about what are healthy protectors. Maybe that was the word you used, I can't remember.
Sure. Well,
What would be some examples of that?
yeah, there are a lot of examples. Way back, before I went to grad school, I worked in the University of Waterloo in a study on children in play school in 3 different age groups divided by sex, and we studied them for their what we call naturalistic behaviors in the context of and one of the things that came clear is how consistent and true there is that certain kinds of protectors are in play for all children, and you can observe that, anything from urges to protect the back of one's head or to step back from danger. All of those are what we think of as really good to have that. The ability to experience pain and react quickly is a great protector. What IFS is addressing itself to is protectors that have gone into an extreme way of coping because they are confronted with something that's overwhelming. And so they resort to a more extreme response. And at the heart of it, though, is the recognition that there is a healthy, natural way of living, of expressing and protecting oneself. Ultimately, what we're talking about is the ability to have love and to have safety, two universally powerful motives for us human beings. And we're born with that capacity to do that. And there's research that highlights natural and healthy ways of self-protection that are in play in infanthood.
So I'm just thinking, like setting healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be an example?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily trying to disconnect, but it's connecting to your big self
That's right.
in a healthy way. So boundaries, I mean, it just came to me, but
That's right.
that might be an example too.
Yeah, that's a great example. And often what we're working with sometimes is the creation of healthy boundaries by noticing the difference between shrunken boundaries where I really can't engage at all, everything else is dangerous outside, or over-inclusive boundaries where I feel terribly responsible for everyone and I'm giving myself away and I'm giving people stuff that they don't even need or want, So supporting people to rediscover the essential, healthy, functional value of that protective strategy. So instead of pathologizing it, we're just saying, we need to readjust how this protector serves you. And then we need to investigate what are the factors that keep it going the way it does, and what's possible to bring it into what we think of as something that works for you.
I would suppose that would include knowing when to steer clear of people who are just bad for us to be around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, you think of professional boundaries a lot, but I was listening to what you were saying, and I was thinking, you're supposed to be sort of non-judgmental of all people and, welcoming to all and all, but if you have a protective boundary, you know where the dangerous people are, that you don't owe them anything to put yourself in harm's way by being around them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen lots of people who hang out with the wrong people, because they don't have that strong enough sense of protectiveness.
Yeah.
Healthy protectiveness.
Yeah, that's right. There's a sense of, without question, we recognize on a regular basis what we think of as good judgment. When I get a phone call from someone who's promising me money and just asking me for my ID so they can send me this money, healthy protection is, hang on a second here. But there's healthy self-protection, and of course one of the dilemmas that we'll often see is people who are not able to have a healthy sense of boundaries that says, this is not good for me. An example would be sexual abuse victims that often can either shut down completely or become promiscuous and kind of struggling to master the experience of abuse by becoming overactive sexually. And where's the boundary, where's the way in which protection is actually working for you? And often the journey is, either to discover more safety in your life by learning tools and mechanisms for working with yourself, which can be the capital S self, talking to that part of you that is very traumatized, very injured. What do you need in order to feel safer in this world? So there's a lot of ways in which our ability to recognize the right stuff, the right thing, the right ability is often characteristic of people who have achieved a degree of self-connection and self-trust that means they operate in flow. Something is saying, message from somewheres, in flow, we don't necessarily figure it out, but we just suddenly know the right thing to do. And that's a deep kind of connectedness that often involves inspiration, which requires us to have a quality of openness and self-trust that we can access what is available to us in terms of inspiration or guidance or that still small voice that has a heck of a lot of good wisdom to offer you if you were willing to listen. So there's a lot to that. Even in infanthood, infants know the smell of their mother, and they know where it's safe, and they know where they belong by their. That wasn't a hand up, was it?
It was actually.
Oh, okay.
So then I got scratchy.
Okay.
I'm wondering, like, for the intro talk is, because I know there's also a personality, like, or a part that's called like the managers.
Okay,
For,
so
like,
can you speak a little bit louder? I'm sorry, I'm not.
Oh, no, it's okay. One of the, like, categories of parts is managers, like
Yeah.
there's like protectors, exiles, and managers.
Yeah.
And for like the intro talk, is there a reason why you exclude managers?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it, like, what is the purpose of exclude, like, are they more complicated?
Yeah. Okay, so different kinds of protection, right?
Yeah.
There is protectors that we call situational protectors. They only arise in circumstances where a particular trigger is present, you know? It could be a young man struggling with dating and gets triggered into high anxiety or insecurity or unworthiness in the face of that prospect. But it's only in those environments because on the basketball court, he's really, pretty confident, pretty at ease with himself. Then there are what we call managers, which are sort of more always in play.
So it's like a subcategory of protectors?
Yes, these are different kinds of protectors. We can have managers, and then we have firefighters, which are the extreme version that essentially are protectors that react without regard to consequence using extreme measures.
Right, okay.
Sort of like the firefighter doesn't come to the house and ring the doorbell and wait patiently. They take an axe to the door, right?
Yeah.
So extreme reactivity that often can be suicidal behavior or dramatic, sometimes addictions and sometimes extreme bouts of anger and violence, those kinds of things often have with them a quality of my protectors are no longer able to hold the dam, hold the river back, and now I slip into the firefighters. And there's other kinds of things that figure into the protection category that are not necessarily us. We have things like legacy burdens. Our parents were in a concentration camp and we live with some of the trauma that is not ours, but somehow has seeped into our experience. Intergenerational trauma. And then we have something that is a little bit more unfamiliar to a lot of people, but I think a lot of other people can get it, which is energies that don't belong to us that have invaded our space. Often people who are very vulnerable can have energies that take over and become very dangerous, dangerously self-destructive or something, but they're not really theirs. And it's kind of like an exorcism. It's kind of like recognizing an energy that's present that is overwhelming, and it needs to be weeded out. Now that's a harder category to recognize or to work with, but I've encountered it occasionally in my work. Where and I have some experience in sitting on a committee that reviewed requests for exorcism for the Catholic Church, so I have that kind of perspective. But there is times when that happens. It's very rare, but it does happen. So different kinds of phenomena that figure into the protection category.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just like the two main categories at the top and then a bunch underneath.
Yeah, this.
Okay.
There's a lot to this.
One or two more questions. It's 8:25. We need to respect our time.
I was amazed how Buddhist
Yes.
IFS is.
Mm-hmm.
It takes so much from that in the sense of mindfulness, awareness, engagement, and transcendence of self. And if you look at the Zen Mahayana tradition, Buddha nature, which sounds like the big S self.
Yeah, the S,
So-
capital S,
Yeah.
capital E.
So the question for you is, what makes the big S self in this system
Yeah.
spiritual and not just psychological? In other words, when you finally can transcend the conditioned nature of self, let it go, and rest in simply an unconditioned state, what makes that spiritual as opposed to just another physiological state?
Yeah, well, it's a good question because there's a couple of dimensions, and one of them is there is such a thing as the pseudo-self, which is parts that represent themselves as self but are not self. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Got a student here that I've got to work more slowly with here. No, there's a sense of recognizing sometimes when we are engaged with this, parts will represent themselves as self and present, what appears to be a perspective or a thought or an idea that is seemingly from capital S self, but it doesn't feel right, and it is kind of a disguise that, some of these parts get rather sophisticated and are not particularly interested in letting go of their role and will resort to things. So there's that aspect that we have to work with. Then there is the aspect that when we talk about spirituality, that capital S self is not particularly caught up in our drama or our narrative. And so it's observant of it in a kind of a neutral way. In Kundalini Yoga, they have the negative mind, the positive mind, and the neutral mind, and the self is the neutral mind. It's not particularly caught up in the drama, but brings compassion and awareness. And you can almost, this is how I picture it, there's a foundational aspect that is very immediate and present and feels like accessible to us without a lot of meditation work or anything. It's available, but self extends into a realm that is the capital S, capital E, and in that sense, it is very much one of expanding qualities of awareness to take us beyond self-referential thinking, self-referential storylines, and into a participation in the larger universe. Now, in Buddhism, of course, the concept of self doesn't have a place. And that was sort of a bit of an academic contention between the Dalai Lama and Dick, when they met. But my sense is that's not much of a stumbling block, because what we're conceptualizing ultimately arrives at the same place, an expanded awareness that is not particular to this. They sometimes use the words, like drawing from quantum physics, wave and particle. Particle, wave. The energy field of our being extends way beyond the form and will extend way beyond the depth of this particular form. And that is a gateway into spirituality, into cosmology, that I find very helpful. And it is something that Kundalini Yoga meditation also give me access to. And that's where they come together. What I've done in meditation or with yoga actually fits very well with work with self, with energy, and the idea of moving beyond personal and particular and locked down ideas of living that are very self-referential and circumstantial. That's just one dimension of us, not to be dismissed. But in the spiritual traditions, they would call that the relative self, not the absolute self. But the relative self is pretty darn real and pretty darn important. And so we want to give value to that in the same way that we give value to the absolute self. And it's neither this nor that, it is both. And that's kind of what I think this model offers us, is that kind of access.
How do you gain clarity within this structure?
How do I?
Gain clarity. You said the one seems
Clarity? Yeah. Well, clarity often comes in the form of inspiration, in the form of an intuitive recognition of what is absolutely true here. And that usually means we have to get anxiety or fear or whatever obstacles have come to play in our life resolved enough that there's spaciousness to access what I think is a source of clarity, which is, as I say, a capacity to listen to the still small voice, or to have an intuitive recognition of what seems right. You know? And that's what I would call clarity. And there are moments when we get that, right? There's moments when you just know what the right thing is, even if you couldn't prove it or, you know, explain it to someone else, you know. And it, you know, it's not a bragging thing. I remember when I was applying for a fellowship, I had an experience of having to submit this essay that would convince them that I was a valuable person, they should really take me on, you know. I wrote a proposal that I thought was good, but when at the end of it, I was very dissatisfied and it felt kind of empty, like I'm done with it. I'm not really that interested in spending a whole year studying this. And so I asked myself, what would be the thing that would really grab me and would make my year a vital year? And I came upon the idea of spirituality and psychology, and I just ripped it off like that. And when I was finished, I knew I would get the fellowship. Now, that's clarity without any particular reason to think that that's so. You know, like, how do I know? There's 4 different provinces, all the professionals applying for this thing. How would I know? But I just had that. And that's kind of an interesting experience to have. A kind of knowing that goes beyond anything that you can figure out or plan or control. But with, you know, a degree of skill and openness, you can access clarity that will be a very helpful guide at crucial times.
One more question.
Are you sure? Because I know this level was 2 and then was 2.
Go ahead and ask your question.
I can pass, I don't want to.
That's very kind of you to be sensitive, but you're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really like how you describe the way we can engage with our many parts by being curious and practice the 8 C's to disengage from our fears and other negative emotions. Would you have some easy techniques you could share with us on how in the moment when we have anxiety and anger problem in responding to a situation that we perceive as threatening, we can use? So like, if we do not yet have the impulse control, reactive control that you spoke of, yet in check, which would you, like, let's say with your clients, if they come into your office first and you just start working with them, as you still need to build on those introspection skills with the 8 C's, like what would you, like, which, easy techniques you can.
Yeah. Well, easy techniques often come as a result of a lot of hard work, right?
Yeah. But,
So what I can say is that there are certain basic ideas about you that you can bring to situations that will help. And one of them is the ability to ask yourself, what am I aware of? What's going on for me right now that will help me to name and pay attention to my experience rather than just automatically try to get away from it, shut down, dismiss myself. You know, so the willingness to be able to ask. And sometimes what will happen is you'll ask yourself the next day, what happened to me back then? So it will still be a useful inquiry, even if it's, you know, after the fact, right? What can I recognize what's going on for me? What can I name? And perhaps that opens the door to recognizing, I think I need to apologize, or I need to phone that person back and say, I'm sorry, I realized that I can't agree to do that particular project that you've asked me to do. I said yes yesterday, but I'm sorry. I thought about it and I realized, you know, a deeper recognition of what I feel guides me to say, I can't do that, or I won't do that. That would be a way of appreciating that. It also helps to just practice thinking, what's going on for me has value and meaning, and as hard as it is, there's something I can learn from this. That helps all by itself, to just bring that. And again, often the way we change is not by getting it in the moment, but by getting it after the fact, where we can say, what was going on for me there? And what can I possibly imagine would help this to make sense? That would help me to recognize I'm not crazy, I'm not wrong, I'm not pathologized in some particular sense. I am in need of something. Can I trace that trailhead back to what do I need right now? And what can I do about that need? That would be a couple of quick examples. Hopefully that's helpful.
I think that's probably the subject of your next talk for us, Michael.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.